part two of dinosaurs and the flood, and some of the things that dinosaurs tell us about that. And so with that, let's begin. Let me go to PowerPoint. So welcome to part two of dinosaurs and Noah's flood. We're going on a hunt. We're going to be looking for some tracks today. Continuing to talk about dinosaurs and what they tell us about the young Earth creation proposal that most of the sedimentary rocks are all around the world were laid down by a catastrophic flood less than 5,000 years ago. And we're going to use them to test this proposal a little bit. Last time we looked a little bit at the time frames that they have, and we said, wow, this stuff all had, in their model, had to be deposited really rapidly, really catastrophically, not a lot of time for any pauses. But wait, dinosaur eggs told us that sometimes there were some pauses, long enough at least, for dinosaurs to come around, lay some eggs, and for the eggs to begin to mature and grow after they were laid. That was a problem. This time we're going to look at something called ichnology. Now, ichnology is not the study of things that are icky. It's the study of traces of things that were living at one time. So, for instance, it might be the tracks of dinosaurs. It might be all kinds of little things that are left behind, which are remnants of that, but they're not the direct animal themselves or any part of the animal. They're just the tracks of them or just the traces that are left behind. We'll look at some of them in kind of some general ways, and then we're going to look particularly at some spectacular examples in Utah in the Black Hawk Formation. And then next time we'll look at some of the claims regarding soft tissue and how that might relate. Does that tell us something very different this way? So let's go forward. Young Earth creationists definitely believe in dinosaurs. You know, there was a time when many people felt like these might have been just some sort of strange things which were created maybe by the devil to confuse people. But that's not what young Earth creationists are saying. They believe they existed, but they have to fit them in somewhere. Were they marching onto the ark? That's what some would say. Did they really just kind of miss the boat? Let's look at some ichnology and look at what that might tell us about that. So if ichnology is not icky things, it can be the traces of things that might have been a little bit icky. What we have here is the trail left behind by a trilobite, a little arthropod, just a little creature that was moving along the bottom of the water there. We might find other types of things or insects. Sometimes they just went all over the place, like in, for instance, this case, which was a kind of a slug-like animal that traveled along back in the Cambrian time. The Cambrian time was around 500 million years ago, a long time ago. We find traces from trilobites, from insects, and from dinosaurs. You know, bones can tell us a lot about dinosaurs, but maybe bones could have been transported into place really rapidly. But the tracks give us a lot of added information about how the creatures really lived. How did they move? What did they do on a day-to-day basis? So now I'm going to move my picture around. I used this chart in the last video to talk about the time frames, and you remember that on this we've expanded the flood interval that's as it is interpreted by ICR, by Tim Cleary, and by Andrew Snelling. And you notice that they were very different that way. And we're going to look at some dinosaur tracks, and they're all out of this Mesozoic period. In this case, we're going to look at dinosaur tracks from the Glenrose dinosaurs, which were, geologists would say, would have formed around 110 million years ago during the early Cretaceous time. And then we'll also look at some later from the Black Hawk tracks, which would have been near the end of the flood at least by Dr. Snelling's area, maybe near the peak of the flood in Dr. Clary's interpretation. To me, it's kind of interesting that the idea that you could have these dinosaurs walking around during or right after a flood by any stretch of the imagination. Some have proposed that maybe they were running away from the flood, but that doesn't seem to be the way the tracks look. So first, we can take a look at where dinosaurs have been found, starting in Texas and in New Mexico and northern Mexico. And you can see that the Mesozoic rocks are in color. The Cretaceous rocks are in green. So most of the tracks in Texas are found within these Cretaceous rocks. There's a really interesting claim made particularly about some tracks around the Dinosaur Valley State Park. That's near Glen Rose, Texas, just outside of Glen Rose. And there's a couple of photographs of some of the dinosaur tracks that are shown here. And you can see they're weaving and wandering around. There's several different types of dinosaur tracks that are found. But the claim is that some of these dinosaur tracks also have with them some human tracks. So some young Earth creationists claim that's just as in the picture here, that along with some of these dinosaur tracks, there were some human tracks as well. So we need to take a look at that. It's worth noting that these tracks are set on top of about 8,000 feet of older rock that's also interpreted by young Earth creationists to be flood deposits. How does that work? Any visions of dinosaurs running to get away from an advancing flood don't seem to work because there's all of this flood deposits down below that. But where were these dinosaurs before they formed these tracks? Where were they during the flood at that time? That makes an interesting question. Where were the dinosaurs in the flood? Dr. Tim Clary of ICR says that he has worked this out. He solved the mystery of these tropical dinosaurs. And here's what he proposes. He proposes that there was a dinosaur peninsula, that there were these pre-flood uplands where there's very little Mesozoic sediment up there, and that was a big home for dinosaurs running up and down the North American continent. So let's look at where his dinosaur peninsula falls on the map of Texas where we were looking at. So the orange outlines on here shows the kind of the main bodies of his dinosaur peninsula. And you notice that the tracks all kind of fall outside of that. So apparently the dinosaurs were up in these areas and then they came down during the flood, because there's a lot of flood sediments underneath them, down toward the coastline, I guess, at that time. And they left tracks. And I guess they all drowned after that point. That's an interesting proposal. I don't think I would think that is supported by the data that we have at all. It just doesn't make much sense. Let's look at where the dinosaur tracks in Texas at that Dinosaur Valley State Park were formed. Where these dinosaur tracks from the Dinosaur Valley State Park outside of Glen Rose, Texas, what it might have looked like back in the day, back in the time when things were deposited. This is a geologic map which shows some of the depositional environments that we see in that. What you see is these blue areas kind of down towards the Gulf of Mexico today, and they had large reefs trending around them in the Cretaceous time. Large reefs going that way, and then back towards the shoreline, back towards the north, you have these deltas and shore fronts. So you've got a series of deltas, you've got a series of shore zones in between those, and sure enough, the Dinosaur Valley State Park falls in one of these shore zones. Interesting to note that on here it says where the sauropods pass, they tend to be going down towards the south. So they weren't running away from a flood. They would have been running towards the coastline, where presumably the floodwaters would have been coming, particularly if there was any dinosaur peninsula up to the north of there. Kind of a difficult thing to look at. Let's take a look at what we find. So this is a picture of Glenn Cuban. He is an expert in the dinosaur tracks in this kind of area in the Glen Rose area. And he's there with some dinosaur tracks when he took us out on an excursion. My wife's kind of in the background there. And we took a look at these. And this is some of the categories of dinosaurs according to his work. What we see is, of course, there are the theropods. These were the metosauruses. These are the ones that were eating things. And then kind of in the bottom left, you see that we do see some big sauropods, these big plant-eating dinosaurs, giant things that were walking around that way. But you also have some strange dinosaurs in the upper right. He calls these the metatarsal dinosaurs or dinosaur tracks. These dinosaurs had kind of a crouching pose. And when they would walk, they would crouch particularly before they took jumps and things. And some of these tracks begin to look a little bit like they were human. And you'll find that in the literature, that some of these called like the Taylor sites and stuff were human tracks. They don't look very human to me. What Glenn has shown is that you can see where these tracks, which appear to be human at times, grade directly into those that are very obviously dinosaur tracks. And so that's really a false interpretation. But there's another case. There are some which seem to be human tracks, but we believe that those really were made by humans, but not humans walking in the early muds back then, but actually humans that were carving these type of tracks. And you can find this particular track, which is known as the Burdick track, in the Creation Evidence Museum that's near the Glen Rose Park. We can look at some more details on that, because as you can see in the picture, this has been sawed. And so this is a claim. This is an alleged giant man track from Glen Rose, Texas. It's got some severe anatomical errors, and it's got some subsurface features that confirmed it had a carved origin to it. It was apparently carved by a Glen Rose resident, George Adams, back in the 30s. He would make dinosaur tracks, and in this case, more of a human track, and sell them. It's interesting that what they found whenever they sawed it, though. You can see the saw marks, and this is published online. You know, it's very interesting what we find here. The limestone that it's carved in shows evidence of these algal deposits known as stromatolites. And we see some examples of stromatolites that are active today, such as the picture that's here from Sharks Bay, Australia. And if we zoom in on this Burdick point, so here the track has been turned upside down, and what you see is some of these stromatolites, these bands formed by algae that are coming upward, just like the Sharks Bay example would do. And it shows that this was actually carved on the bottom of a limestone bed, because it made apparently a better surface for carving on, and carved on the bottom means it could not have been actually formed in a natural way. Now, to be fair, some of the leading sites, such as the Institute for Creation Research, ICR, or Answers in Genesis, say not to use this claim in arguing for the young Earth creation, but you'll still find sites all over the web which use these as examples of humans walking with dinosaurs. I'm afraid that would be a very bad case to make. There's just no evidence of that. So let me move my talking window over here, and let me set the stage a little bit for the type of tracks that we're going to look at next. Set the stage. If deposition is taking place at rates of feet per day, the way young Earth creation models say, how do you get whole trees that are preserved in a growth position? Now, here's an example of a 1918 photograph from a coal mine. How long does it take a tree like this to grow? Now, I recognize that there are cases where whole trees' trunks can be moved and they can float, but I really doubt that this one did. And we're going to look at some more. This one doesn't have any evidence of dinosaurs in with it, but hang on, we'll get that in the next cases. What we're going to look at is we're going to go to Utah and look at what I consider one of the most troubling sites for young Earth creation ever. We're going to be looking at creation deposits from a book that was written by a man by the name of John Balsey. Dr. Balsey wrote this, and I got it on a field trip that he led in this area in Utah. And he talks about wave-dominated delta systems from the Book Cliffs in east central Utah. We're going to look at some of the rocks. They're some of the most studied rocks in the world when it comes to looking at their stratigraphy and looking at how they were deposited. So I'm going to show some examples that Dr. John Balsey described back in 1983. So I was able to go on a field trip in Utah that John led. The book describes some work that he did a few years before. The part I want to talk about was the work in coal mines in this region. Now, occasionally these coal mines would include a bed of siltstone, probably deposited by a spring flood or some sort of local storm. And the miners in this area would see these, and they would mine out the coal down below them, and they would recognize these dinosaur tracks on the bottoms of the beds. And they brought in John Balsey to help study them. So here's some of the examples. First of all, let's look at some roots that they saw. Now, the beds that they're describing are from the Black Hawk Formation, and Balsey has mapped out a series of shallow deltas. They're wave-dominated deltas, similar to the deltas that form along the Texas coast today. But behind the shoreline, there were coals deposited in these ancient swamps. And in this area, they were able to map distinct areas with palm roots, like the one on the left, and those from conifer trees, like the one on the right. But they also found dinosaur tracks in among them. So here's a map of dinosaur tracks from the Black Hawk Formation. And what you're seeing, you see a coal pillars, and then along where they actually mined out. Looking up at the roof, you have what are shown in blue as dinosaur tracks, what are shown as green as these tree stumps or tree roots that were there. And then you see in series of brown, you would see these fallen tree trunks. Wouldn't it be cool to be able to look up and walk around a mine and look up at the ceiling and see this type of thing, see all these ancient trees where they were growing? It would be like a swamp area that way. I think it takes a very determined young earth creationist to argue that these trees were all floated into place by the flood, and then the dinosaurs ran around them. For one thing, the dinosaurs don't seem to be running. Here are some pictures of some of the dinosaur tracks enlarged a little bit that way. These are large tracks, and the ones that are shown in the map are just those that were fairly complete. There were lots and lots more of them and that were evident that way, but just not complete ones. So what did it look like when they were actually growing and when the dinosaurs were there? Probably looked a little bit like this. This is in the Cato Lake in East Texas, and it's a swamp, and you can see the trees, in this case, cypress trees that were growing up through the swamp. And this one probably looked very similar to that at that time. Now, the trees just didn't grow in a few hours or in a few days. They weren't swept into place. The dinosaurs were feeding on foliage. It was an ancient feedlot. They were not running from anything. This was a long pause in sedimentation. Now, in Utah, the Cretaceous is about 6,000 feet thick. That would mean that the deposition had to average around 70 feet per day. In Dr. Snelling's slower model for this, hard to grow a tree in 70 days, and dinosaur tracks just shouldn't have been found in that case. So I want to emphasize that by looking at this piece of rock, we have what are clear mud cracks on it. Now, I think you've probably seen these type of things. Wet, muddy sediments will dry out, and we find the cracks that form when wet, muddy sediments dry out, we find cracks that form just as when wet, muddy sediments dry out, we find cracks that form as the soil dried out. I like to walk on these and crunch these, and you may too. Perhaps dinosaurs did. You can see a couple of dinosaur tracks on this example right here. Now, sediment drying out for a period of time seems to be something really surprising to take place during a flood. Young Earth creationists often proclaim that geologists have misinterpreted. They were not made by muddy rocks drying out. And there are some features that are a little bit like mud cracks, which can form underwater near the sediment interface down below that are known as syneresis cracks. But when you find footprints on top of them, that's a very helpful clue. That makes it a really pretty high confidence that these really were mud cracks, and this really was sediment that dried out for a period of time. There was a pause of sedimentation for at least a few days. You can't do that overnight. You can't do that in a few minutes. That's what the flood model demands. So every time in the geologic record where we find mud cracks, we know there was a pause in sedimentation for at least a few days. Is this the only place that occurs? Hardly. Here's some examples. Of course, the one on the left is recent mud cracks from Spring, Texas, where I live. But the one on the right is mud cracks and dinosaur tracks, and I'll zoom in on those a little bit. where you can see the dinosaur footprints as they tracked across the mud-cracked area. It's hard to misinterpret those. They seem pretty clear. This example is from Arizona. Look at some spectacular examples in Utah. So moving my photo down, I'm going to show you a map. This is a map of sites from all around the world where I found articles which describe dinosaur tracks that are associated with mud cracks. We'll take a look at a few examples of these, but you can see this is really widespread. So here's an example from Brazil. And you can see the dinosaur tracks clearly marked on this that are walking through this area. Very clear desiccation or mud cracks that formed there. Paper by Carvalho in 2013. Now these were on microbial mats that were partially hardened on an alluvial fan there. They describe these this way. The formation of well-defined displacement rims around the prints of large dinosaurs occurs in thick, plastic, moist to water unsaturated microbial mats on top of moist to water unsaturated sediments. Moist, but not underwater. These were things that were walking around on moist, muddy material that was drying out. Here's an example from Portugal. There's one that I highlighted. Again, these are from Jurassic. Again, clear mud cracks on them and dinosaurs walking around on it. Here's an example from Madagascar, described by Wagensummer and others. I'm going to expand this a little bit in this section here so that you can see that what they're seeing, multiple layers with dinosaur tracks, multiple layers with mud cracks in them. And this is an example of one of these where you see the dinosaur track, you see the way the mud has been pushed out and squeezed out from underneath that when the weight of the dinosaur walked on it there. A neat case. And I'm going to show you one final example on this. In this case, I haven't pulled any photos for the tracks, but what interests me is just the number of beds that are involved in this case. In this case, to looking at this area in particular, we zoom in on it and we see, of course, there's a lot of fish fossils in it. These would be freshwater fish from lakes. And what we see is, of course, 17 different beds that have dinosaur tracks on them. So a bunch of separate beds where these dinosaurs were walking around. And then we have at least 2 beds where there were roots that are formed in them. These were from paleosoils. These were where lots of plants grew in them. And then you have 13 different beds where you had mud cracks in them. Kind of a neat association of all of these things together that way. So I want to sum up some of the things. And we'll go to this slide here and show again where some of these fossils were found. We found them in the Cretaceous and the Jurassic. We could look at other places. But for instance, in this case, what we're saying is that there's, again, no evidence in any of them of any human tracks with them. There's no evidence of humans with dinosaurs at all. The tracks are associated with trees that grew in place. Sometimes they're associated with mud cracks. There's multiple levels of tracks and mud cracks. And they're found from all around the world. Lots of evidence to look at that way. All of this is just inconsistent with the idea that these were actually deposited by one large catastrophic flood. You had too many pauses in sedimentation. It tells you that sediment had to give time for these trees to grow, for the dinosaurs to march around. We saw that they have eggs in the last presentation, and the eggs had time to grow up and hatch. That just can't happen during one particular flood. Well, there's at least one more part to consider on this. In the next one, we will kind of look at soft tissue a bit and see, does that really contradict the idea that things were deposited over millions of years? Tune in one more time and we'll take a look at that. Thank you. Y'all come back now.